Hello and welcome to Presenting, a podcast where we chat about various topics related to role-playing games, typically Paizo products such as Pathfinder and Starfinder, but also others. I'm John Godek, and with me today is James L. Sutter. Welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, I'm really excited to have a chance to chat with you. I'm a huge Paizo fan, especially Starfinder, but Pathfinder as
Thank
well.
you.
And to get to talk with somebody who was so instrumental in the creation of both, that's big stuff for me. So thanks for agreeing.
Well, thank you. Yeah, no, this is exciting.
Yeah. So James is the co-creator of both Pathfinder and Starfinder role-playing games, having worked for Paizo from 2004 to 2017, where he started as an editor on Dungeon Magazine, later moved to do foundational work for Pathfinder, and eventually becoming the creative director in charge of launching Starfinder, as well as the executive director of the Pathfinder novels line for both Paizo and Tor. Or I guess that's Paizo Tor. It's combined.
Yeah.
Joint thing, right? James is also the author of the forthcoming young adult romance novel, Dark Hearts, that just came out as of this recording yesterday. Congratulations on that. So that's
Thank
very
you.
exciting.
Yeah.
And that's from Wednesday Books. He also
Which is part of
has.
Macmillan.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that. That's good. That's cool.
Yeah, well, that's how it is in publishing, right? Where like everything is an imprint of something else, all the way up the chain.
You've also had the fantasy novel Death's Heretic, which was a finalist for the Compton Crook Award for Best First Novel. He also wrote The Redemption Engine, which won the 2015 Scribe Award for Best Original Speculative Novel. His short stories have appeared in Nightmare, the magazine of fantasy and science fiction, Beneath Ceaseless Skies, Escape Pod, and the #1 Amazon bestseller Machine of Death. He's also written comic books, essays in venues like Clark's World and Lightspeed, Queers Destroy Science Fiction, and a wealth of tabletop gaming material and video games. His most recent work in this area includes the Starfinder audio game for Amazon's Alexa, featuring Nathan Fillion and Laura Bailey, as well as the Starfinder Angels of the Drift comics from Dynamite, coming out again later this month. When he's not writing, which I don't know when that would be, James has performed with musical acts ranging from metalcore to musical theater. You can find James on his website, jameslsutter.com, and on Twitter at JamesLSutter. So one of the things I'll mention, James, is that you have one of the most extensive bios of anybody I've interviewed. And I've interviewed some interesting people like Steve Jackson and Jeff Grubb and stuff. And but yours is just kind of like so extensive across a couple genres and stuff. So I think
Well, thank you. I mean, it's
awesome.
because it's so random, is what it is, right? It's one of those things where it's so many different things. Because I'm a total dilettante. I always like bouncing around to different genres and media and whatnot.
Yeah. Well, for the last 20 years, you've been bouncing around, working in the publishing industry. Can you talk about how you got started here in the first place and on this journey, and how you became such an accomplished game designer and award-winning author?
Well, So it really started for me in college when I started doing journalism for the college paper, and I was doing a lot of rock criticism, getting free concert tickets to go to shows, and then that became doing gonzo journalism where I'd go have adventures and then write about it, and I thought that was great. I thought, oh, this is what I'll do for the rest of my life. And then I got out of college and realized that your average suburban newspaper doesn't want to pay you to go have adventures or write about sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And so I pretty quickly realized that that was not for me. But I still loved writing. I just didn't like the reporting angle. And so I was looking around for a place to put, those journalistic skills to work, and realized that Dungeon, Dragon, and Amazing Stories were all run by Paizo, which was only a few miles from where I was living. And so I saw Amazing Stories was hiring an editor-in-chief at the time. And so I emailed Lisa Stevens, just sort of cold called and was like, hey, I see you're looking for an editor-in-chief. I am totally unqualified for that, but here's what I have done. Like, here's my portfolio, what I've written. Do you have any positions available? And I guess she liked my, chutzpah because she brought me in and interviewed me and said, well, we don't have an editorial position open right now, but let's see what we can find. And so that was how I got my first freelance job for Paizo, which was finding images for their new web store, which was new at the time, at a
Mhm,
nickel a
mhm.
JPEG. That was like I
Wow.
was a human search engine. And then from that, I became the editorial intern on the magazines, which is where I really started learning to do that job. And then that turned into a full time customer service job. And eventually, within about a year or something like that, maybe two, I made it onto staff at Dungeon as assistant editor, and then really just worked my way up through all the changes there. Working on the magazines, learning from all the other staff, and then we made Pathfinder, and then that kind of blew up both the setting and the game, and got really popular. And then I was sort of always the fiction guy because, well, I didn't have a lot of experience at the time. I had sold a couple of short stories in college and
Mhm,
right afterwards. So the other folks in the editorial pit kind of said, "Well, James, you're the fiction guy, so you'll be in charge of like the Pathfinder's journal, which was in the back of,
mhm.
which was the little serialized fiction in the back of Pathfinder Adventure Path." And then that became the novel line that I got to helm for its entire 40 or 50 books, however many we did there. And that was really a huge training ground for me in terms of just seeing how a novel gets made. I was
Mhm.
getting to go contact all these experienced, incredibly talented authors and commission Pathfinder novels that went from sort of the initial inception and finding the author all the way through to publication. And so watching that process, getting to really be elbows deep in it, is what gave me both a lot of the skills and the confidence, frankly, to try writing a novel on my own. And so I eventually did the two Pathfinder novels, which, funnily enough, I was never going to write a Pathfinder novel because I figured that as the editor in charge of the line, that would
Right,
be, nepotism. It would be self dealing, right? Like,
right. Yeah.
how could I believe that I'd gotten it honestly if I gave myself the assignment? So I wasn't going to do it. And then one day I was printing off some short story submissions on the office printer, like you do. And I ran to the copy room, and Eric Mona, the publisher, was
Yeah,
standing
yeah.
there reading one of them. And I went, "Oh no." Um, and he was saying, "Oh," and my name wasn't on it. So he said, "Oh, this is really good. Is this somebody you're considering for the novel line?" And I said, "Well, actually, those are mine. Sorry." And he was like, "Oh, well, you should write a novel." And I explained, "Well, I can't write a novel because I don't want to like give myself a book. Like that's not kosher." And then he said, "I'm your boss. Like, you're not giving yourself a novel. I'm telling you to write a novel." And I went, "Oh, uh, yes, sir." And so that's how I ended up writing Death's Heretic. And yeah, and so, the novel line, that was super fun. Getting to work on the comics was, of course, a joy. And it now getting to come back to do more comics with the new Starfinder Angels of the Drift series has been delightful to come back to those characters and that world. But yeah, so I kind of did a little bit of everything while I was at Paizo, in terms of development, editing, managing all those different things. And then, of course, when we made Starfinder, I got to be the creative director on that and lead the team through, that 1 year of both joy and hell, as we had a
Mhm.
year to get the book, the game and the core rulebook and everything from an idea to final product. And that was amazing, and obviously the game was a hit. And then I came back from that Gen Con where we all spent the weekend feeling like rock stars, and I
Yeah.
said, I think this is as good as it gets. I think I should just go out on a high note because it's not going to get any better than this. And so I pretty shortly thereafter stepped down as creative director and left the company to write full time. And so obviously I've still been writing adventures and things, occasionally freelance, for both Paizo and for Wizards. I've been doing some Dungeons and Dragons stuff too. But mostly I've been focusing on fiction, which is where this new young adult novel, Dark Hearts,
Mhm.
comes from, which is about as far from my old stuff as you can get because it's a queer young adult contemporary romance novel set in Seattle, and it's all about falling in love with the boy who stole your chance to be a rock star. And it really, pulls a lot from my own life as an underage musician in Seattle, and also my own experiences coming out and all of that sort of
Mhm,
thing.
mhm,
So,
mhm.
yeah, that kind of brings us to today.
Wow, that's quite a whole set of careers in there in such a
I know,
you think
right?
about it, for somebody who's so young, to have accomplished so much here over time.
Well, I
You
got I got an early start because I started at Paizo. I graduated college when I was 20, and
Mhm,
immediately fell in at Paizo within 6 months of getting out.
mhm.
So I literally started working at Paizo before I was old enough to drink. I couldn't go to the bar with the coworkers.
Right, right, right. Wow. You mentioned, Dark Hearts, the novel that was just, released yesterday. You said it's kind of inspired by your own life growing up. Um, can you talk a little bit more about that novel and why you decided to share that experience, in the form of a young adult novel like that?
Yeah, yeah. So the novel is all about this guy David. He's the main character who, in middle school, he formed a band with his best friends, and they played a bunch, got pretty good, but then everybody's egos got big, and he stormed
Mm,
out. But as soon as he stormed out, the band got huge without him. So now he's 17. He's
uh,
stuck in high school as a normal kid, while his former best friends and bandmates are out there being world famous pop stars. So he's obviously very bitter about this. But then when tragedy throws him and the lead singer back into contact, they start sort of remembering why their friendship existed in the first place. And then also find that they actually are kind of into each other, which they never suspected before. David's always thought he was straight, but suddenly he finds
mm,
himself falling for this his frenemy, and so they begin sort of secretly dating. Uh, and as they do, David starts to think, well, maybe this is my chance to get back in the band and get the fame and fortune that I've been denied. But of course, anytime you start thinking, oh, what
yeah.
can I use my romantic partner to get? Things go south real quickly. So yeah, so the story really, for me, like I said, it was about a lot of things. But as when I was, so I started a punk band when I was 15, and while we never got huge, we played a lot. We got on the radio a couple of times. It was really
Mhm,
fun and was kind of all consuming for me. I thought of myself as a band guy, but I can remember being like 18 and watching younger bands coming up behind me, getting big, getting signed, and really feeling like I'd missed my shot, like I was a
mm,
has been,
mhm,
and especially once the band broke up, you think of a 19-year-old thinking, well, I guess I'm washed up. I guess like that's all over. It feels now at 39, looking back, it feels silly to think how sure I was that my life was over at that point. But
mhm,
I think there are a lot of kids walking around with that, whether it's for music or theater or sports, that idea of you thought you were going to be a success right out of high school and then you weren't. What do you do with that? Because most people do not become child stars and most people do not become
right,
rock stars.
right,
So, what do you do when the labels you use to define yourself as, a future rock star or a future whatever, no longer seem to apply? And so that was something that I really wrestled with. But also, it kind of dovetailed nicely into the question of, it took me until I was 20 to realize I was bisexual. And I think that that was another place where the labels were really hard for me, where I'd
mm,
always
mhm,
thought I was one person. And then sort of realized like, oh, there's more here than I thought there was, but I wasn't sure, like, could I claim the label? Was I queer enough for the label?
mm,
That
mm,
kind of thing. And
mhm,
so just all of those questions of identity really sort of swirled around and were things that I wanted to put into a young adult novel, because there's things that I wish that somebody had talked with me about when I was that age.
mhm,
Um,
mhm,
so there was a lot of me just like processing and talking to teenage me through the book. But
mm,
at the same time, the real reason I started writing it is because when the pandemic hit, I was working on a big, dystopian space opera kind of thing. And I just lost steam because the world was so dark at the time.
Mhm.
And I started reading a bunch of young adult romance and, rom-coms just to cheer myself up. And it was so fun. And I have this thing where it is almost impossible for me to consume really good art and not be immediately inspired to try and kind of
Mm.
imitate it and see, like,
Mhm.
well, if I, it doesn't matter that I've spent my whole life playing, like punk and metal. If I hear a, really good bluegrass band, I'll be like, I wonder if I could do that. Maybe I should buy a banjo,
Mm.
I have in fact bought a banjo for that
Yeah.
exact reason. Still don't play it well.
Yeah.
But so, I was feeling that. And then I ran across what really sparked it was I ran across the Wikipedia entry for Stuart Sutcliffe, who
Mm.
was the original bassist for the Beatles and left right before they got huge.
Right. Wow.
And I was just thinking, God, what would it have been like to have walked away from a band and then watched them become immortal?
Mhm.
And so, and then of course, because my head was in this young adult romance space, my next question was, and then what if you fell in love with one of those guys? And so I, immediately just jumped out of bed and started
Yeah.
typing and wrote the
Yeah.
first couple chapters, and then sort of like sat and looked at it and went, it doesn't make any sense for me to write this, but like I'm a RPG and science fiction fantasy guy. Like my literary agent does science fiction fantasy. Like everything in my career sense tells me that I should be just focused on getting this, space horror thing done and like let this
Mhm.
go. But it just felt too good. Like sometimes when you're writing something, it just flows. And when that happens, I feel like you got to just ride that horse. And so I kind of, without telling my my agent at the time, I sort of put that book aside and started just writing this young adult romance, and it was the quickest, most fun manuscript I'd ever written. And then when I got done, I went, I think this is pretty good. And so it was still, it was still another year before I was able to find the right literary agent and sell
Right.
it. But now it's, like we said, it just came out, but it's on track to being kind of the most successful thing I've ever written, I think.
Wow. Wow.
And so, yeah, I mean, it's hard to measure these things, right? Because
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
there's
Yeah.
a million copies of Pathfinder and
Yeah.
Starfinder out there, but for being something that just, that I got to write that was just me rather than collaborating with a team. And
Right.
I love
Right.
collaboration, but there's also something really fun to just this came entirely out of my brain. And so, within those metrics, it seems to be doing pretty well. And so I guess I'm a young adult romance author now. Didn't expect it.
Well, I think you're due for a 6 or 7 book series then, if that's the case, right?
Well, so the second one, fortunately, they did buy the book in a 2-book contract, and
Nice.
so I'm already finishing up the second book. It's not a direct sequel, but it's still another
Right.
queer young adult romance set in kind of the Seattle area. So hopefully that'll hit in another year or so. But yeah, I'm just frantically trying to get this book launched and make sure that Dark Hearts makes it out to as many people as possible. So fingers crossed.
And how's your screenwriting? Any good at that?
you I've never actually done screenwriting. That's like one of the few, and it's not that different from comics.
Yeah.
And I've looked into it, but it's one of those things where I feel like I've got to draw a line and focus somewhere, right? Like
Why
I
start
can't.
now though? I don't
I know. Like it's advice that I've never taken
Yeah.
before,
Yeah.
but
Yeah. Very cool. Well, that's neat. Kind of along those lines, it's interesting. I was just looking through actually a Twitter feed looking at what's been going on in the tabletop RPG industry of late. Queer representation has changed a lot over 20 years. What did it
right.
look like when you first joined
Oh,
Paizo,
there
and how's
wasn't
it
any,
changed? Yeah.
and actually that's something that I am really
Right.
proud of
Right.
Paizo,
Mhm.
especially, early Paizo. I mean, it's continued to be great. And like they continue to, the folks who are over there right now are continuing to
Mhm.
really push representation and inclusivity.
Right.
And it's amazing. And like all respect to them. But I also have, like, I have to shout out folks like Wes Schneider and
Mhm.
Judy Bauer and some of the like sort
Mhm.
of old school Paizo
Right.
people who were really pushing early on to get representation in there at a time when nobody was doing it, you
Hmm.
know.
Hmm.
And like the fact that we had, queer iconics pretty early on in
Right.
Pathfinder and some of those things, uh it might seem small in the face of what's happening now, but like I feel like in a lot of the ways those folks were the people who got that pebble rolling, and
Hmm.
I like to, that became an avalanche. And I like to think that I helped some with that, but also we all kind of grew up with it. I think people
Hmm.
often don't realize how young everybody was when we started
Right.
Pathfinder and whatnot. I mean, like I said, I started in the game industry when I was 20, and my
Hmm.
coworkers were older than me, but like by 3 years, ooh, which like felt like a big deal at the time, where it's like, oh, these
Yeah.
guys are so much older than me. But like, right, they were like 25, so we were all really growing up together in public, which is why I think you see the game evolve, like the content we were putting out, because
Hmm.
there's so much that we learned along the way. Like I learned a tremendous amount, even just like for instance, I will say it's not necessarily about queer representation, but just about gender balance and things like
Hmm.
that. That was something that when we were all working on the magazines, like, maybe we were theoretically thinking about it a little bit, but it wasn't really in our heads. And it wasn't until I specifically remember Judy Bauer, who was an editor, one of the main editors at Paizo, when she came in, she started just keeping a tally for every adventure or
Hmm.
setting document or whatever. And at the end, when she handed back your document after editing it, she would hand you the tally and say, all right, here's how many named male characters you have, and here's how many named female characters you have. And even when we thought we'd done well, like usually we didn't actually have parity, there usually wasn't
Right.
balance. And it just took somebody, just sort of, it wasn't. And I give so much respect to Judy, because it wasn't even like she, beat us over the head with it. She was just like, hey, here is how you were falling short. And we all went, oh, and then we fixed it. Right.
Hmm.
And, it was just a series. I feel like a lot of the ways Paizo changed for the better were just a series of people coming in, picking an issue, and making a difference. And then
Hmm.
everybody, like, to the credit of the folks working there, I think that it was always, once something was pointed out to you, you went, oh, geez, like I should have been doing better, you know. And then we did, and so I think that, yeah, I think the landscape has gotten a lot better, and I think other game companies also, like there's a ton of queer stuff out there now. I
Hmm.
think Dungeons and Dragons does a great job with that now. I think that, and of course the indie games has always, that scene has always had a really
Right.
diverse array of creators. Um, but yeah, I think in a lot of ways things are getting better, which doesn't mean there's not room for improvement, but it's come so far from, I mean, it was not that long ago when, you know, issues of race and gender and sexuality were just like not even talked about in the game
Right.
industry. You would, right. It wasn't that long ago that people were still playing where genders had different stats, like, or so, yeah, it's really heartening to see.
Cool. You were talking about the start of Starfinder and how you had that 1 year from idea to getting it out
Yeah.
there where it sold out at Gen Con. Can you talk a little bit about the difference between how Pathfinder came to be and how Starfinder came to be, those processes and kind of the reasoning for both of them, I guess?
Yeah, well, so Pathfinder Pathfinder was a game of necessity because we'd been making the official Dungeons and Dragons magazines, obviously,
Mhm.
and then but that was under license from Wizards. And so when the license went away, we needed something to put out. Like we didn't all we knew how to do was adventures and setting material, but we didn't have a game to do it for. We didn't have a license. And so we said, okay, well, we'll make our own setting and publish our own adventures because that's what we know how to do. And we'll just do it for the 3.5 rules set, and that'll be fine. And we did that for maybe a year, maybe more. And that was where Pathfinder Adventure Path came from, was basically just us taking the best of what we did in the magazines, because adventure paths were still a pretty new idea at the time.
Mm-hmm.
We said, like, this is a thing that we've really been kicking ass at, and so like this will be the thing that we stake our claim on. And so we did that, and then the fourth edition thing happened,
Right.
where in addition to the edition change itself, the rules set, people had varying opinions on it, but also just contractually, there was a lot of stuff that would have made it very difficult for us to
Mm-hmm.
make fourth edition content and keep our business model. And so that's where we said, well, 3.5 is still open. So we can take that, we can file off the serial numbers in some ways. I mean, in some ways we didn't even.
Right.
But we can also make all the updates that people have wanted for a long time. And then we can release it as this new game, which we called Pathfinder, and which, even at the time, a lot of people called it 3.75 because it really was
Right.
like the same rules,
Right.
just
Right. Right.
updated. Uh, and it turns out that there were enough people who liked Pathfinder and who were frustrated by fourth edition that we got a ton of people giving it a shot. And then once they did, we had all this momentum. And I think really, we were just the team was just doing really good work. I felt like the setting was so vibrant, the adventures were so good, the game was really, was fun, and it was familiar to people, but there were also new things. And I feel like we just hit, sometimes you get that perfect storm where
Mm-hmm.
everything, was just bringing people in left and right, and we were able to build that up and build out the worlds and really kind of build the company into what it became. And so, but that was, by the skin of our teeth. Nobody could have expected that that would happen. I mean, I literally, I remember when the magazines went away, I remember sitting in that meeting and thinking, I could go back to grad school. Like I'm only,
Yeah.
23 or whatever. Like
Right.
this is fine. Like I'll be okay. But fortunately I didn't have to. And so that was a very different situation from Starfinder, where we already had, you know, a very successful company, very successful game. Everything was going well, but it was one of those things where we'd always kind of wanted to do a science fantasy setting. Like you can only look at something like Warhammer and Warhammer 40K for so long without going,
Mm-hmm.
God, that would be fun, wouldn't it? Like why don't we get to do that with our stuff? And I think it had been in everybody's minds. Nobody was quite sure whether it should be a new game, whether it should be just a hardcover, release for the Pathfinder role playing game as sort of like an alternate rules set. What should it be? But then also we knew by the time it happened, I think there was a sense that it wasn't time for Pathfinder Second Edition, but sooner or later, Pathfinder Second Edition was gonna happen. And so if we were ever going to do this whole new game, we had to do it before second edition, because second edition was going to take, the whole company, all hands on deck,
Right.
a long time to do. So that's why we ended up with that sort of shortened timeline where I remember the meeting where Eric brought us all in and said like, "Hey, I think we should do this thing. I think we should do a game, and I think it should be Starfinder." And there was a lot of debate about whether it was even possible with the sort of the timeline and the staff that we had. And the way I remember it, I could be wrong. The way I remember it is that it was like on a Friday, and we all sort of left the meeting with Eric being like, "Okay, well, let's just think about it, and we'll talk about it on Monday."
Mm-hmm.
And I remember going home and thinking about it. And at the time, I was, the executive editor working on the novel line, like managing the editors, the editing team, and then but I had always loved the science fiction and elements of Pathfinder. I had written a book called Distant Worlds for
Mm-hmm.
Pathfinder that was detailing Pathfinder's solar system. So it was very much sort of the science fiction, science fantasy supplement for the game. And it had been very popular. Like the fans really liked it. And so, I thought about it, and then I came in on Monday and went into Eric's office and said, "Hey, I think we can do this game. I think we should do this game. You know, give it to me and give me a year and I will give you this game." And Eric kind of went, okay, it's yours, and that's how I became creative director.
Yeah.
And, and then it just became a flat out race, especially because, in the beginning, we didn't have a team set up. We didn't have
Right.
dedicated staff. So I'm, pulling bits and pieces from every department as I can. And then as things went on, we slowly got, that structure set up. But it was just a flat out sprint from the very beginning. And it was fun, but it was also grueling because there was just so much that we had to decide. Like, what is this
Mhm.
game going to be? Is it going to be set in the same setting as Pathfinder? Is it going to be, are we going to have the same classes? Are we going to have new classes? Are we going to have the same species? Or is it going to be new player races? That kind of stuff. There was so much to be decided. And then there was just so much work to do to build a new game, and so, we had, when I say everybody was involved, I mean, obviously, you had the designers working on classes, you had developers, working on gameplay and all the setting stuff. But, you had the art department doing incredible work with all the, concept art and everything. But then also you had, right, like the customer service department saved our butt because, like a week before the book went to print, we had a particular like rules subsystem. It was actually the abilities section
Mhm.
that we had a system that was very mathematically elegant, but was a little bit fiddly. And so the way I remember it is that it was Amanda Hammond was like, "Hey, we should just test this one more time." And she took it up to the customer service department and had them make characters, and came back an hour later and just said, they hate it. Like, it's too hard, it's too frustrating. And we went,
Yeah.
oh no. And so, we brought everybody into the office and shut the door and said, okay, we need to find a new system immediately. And, fortunately we did. People tossed out different ideas. I think in the end, Stephen Radney McFarland, one of the design team, proposed the one that we finally went with. And so that was something where, he proposed something. We all went, okay, that could work. And, I made him describe it to me again very carefully. And I went, okay. And I went in my office and I closed the door and I wrote that chapter. And then like we edited it and like sent the book to print. Like it was pretty much
Wow.
just like,
Wow.
here we go. And so there was a lot of stuff like that where it was, uh, there were just such high expectations for the game in a good way, but like we knew the goals were it needs to be as mechanically robust as Pathfinder, but it also needs to be easier to learn. It needs to be a more beautiful presentation with more art. It needs to be it needs to have setting material. It needs to have rules for converting Pathfinder stuff. It needs to have a starship combat mini game. It just
Mhm.
there were so many things that we needed to get in there. It would have been 1,000-page book,
Right.
but it also had to be shorter than the Pathfinder core rulebook. That was my my specification from Eric, and so we did it. I spent so much time boiling down everybody's ideas, because so many people had so many good ideas. And a lot of my job as creative director was just to manage that pagination and try to figure out, okay, how can we do this in 5 pages? How can we do this in 2 pages? How can we get all the cool stuff in there, but still, pull this project off? And I think the game actually really benefited from that in the end, because I
Mhm.
think everything that's in the core rulebook had to, knife fight for the right to be in
Right.
there,
Right.
So, so I'm super proud of it.
Yeah, no, it's great. Were you surprised at how well it was received at Gen Con?
Yes and no. I mean, I think we knew that it was good, and we knew also that it was beautiful. Like the art that, Sarah Robinson was
Mhm.
the art director on it. And there was just so much good art in there that anybody who stopped by the booth and flipped through a copy was blown away. So
Right.
that part didn't surprise me because I felt the same way.
Mhm.
Like going every time I flipped through like the setting chapter and just saw those big, 2-page illustrations of these
Right.
planets, I went, oh, this is what I want in an RPG book. So that part didn't surprise me, but I did. You can never predict how people will react, and so we were just really elated that folks were so into it, and that the Pathfinder crew sort of embraced it with open arms. And also, frankly, that lots of other people did as well. So yeah, I would say we hoped, but you never know.
Right, right. So I'm a huge Starfinder fan, so I'm really glad that you did that. I was able to pick it up right after Gen Con.
Oh, great.
Yeah, I actually was in a group with Scott Kime, who you probably might have
Yeah, yeah,
known
yeah. Of
before.
course.
And as soon as Starfinder came out, and he said, "Hey, there's this cool thing coming out. Maybe we should try that." And so got right into it right from the beginning there. And he told me coming when he came back from Gen Con that they were so overwhelmed that it sold out like the
Oh
first
yeah.
day on at Gen Con or by Saturday I think of
Oh
Gen
yeah. There
Con.
were
Yeah,
lines just
yeah,
like
yeah,
across the convention center.
yeah. And I didn't even know that it had been really marketed that much. So it was just
I mean,
crazy.
I don't know that it had. It was a very like word of mouth thing, and obviously,
Right,
like the marketing
right.
team at Paizo did a good job. But I think you know, I actually think with a lot of our games, word of mouth had always been sort of Paizo's
Right.
primary sales approach. Um, and I think the fact that there were so many people who were already dedicated Pathfinder fans helped a lot, because I think that this was something that people had been to some degree asking for a long time. I
Right.
mean, it's something that we
Right.
internally had been asking for a long time. Like everybody wanted to work on this thing. And I
Mhm,
also think
mhm.
the steady drumbeat of content that we've been leaking with, like, the iconics and their backstories and all that
Right.
stuff.
Right.
I I think it showed the love. I think that you can tell. I feel like I can usually tell when you hit a part of a game book that the author was just in love with, that
Mm,
they
mhm.
really, it wasn't just, well, this is good enough. It was like, no, no, this is my heart and soul on the page. And I feel like that was happening so often with Starfinder, where people were just throwing themselves into it. I mean, I know that's how I feel about, a lot of the iconic characters, and,
Mhm.
especially the sections that I was working on in particular, because I mean, obviously, as creative director, I kind of worked on the whole book. But there are things that I got to write the first draft of as well. And it was oftentimes setting stuff, playable species, things like that. And I can even look at that for myself and just see how much I was enjoying the
Mhm.
chance to explore all this new territory, which was
Right.
always my favorite part of working in the role-playing game industry. From the beginning, my favorite thing is world building when there's a blank canvas or an almost blank canvas. And so, some of those early gazetteers for Pathfinder that I got to write, stuff where it was like, hey, here's Kyonin. You know, tell us everything about Kyonin, or design all the locations in Belkson, or even like Varisia.
Mhm.
Varisia was James Jacobs's baby originally, but when he first brought it in, he had, a few locations on the map,
Right.
and then there was a lot of empty space. And so in, I think, Pathfinder Adventure Path number 3, he handed me that map and said, fill out the rest. And so getting to go through there
Yeah.
and, just populate this map with locations and adventure stuff, when that would come to be one of the hearts of the campaign setting. But at the time, we just didn't know anything. And
Right.
I love that feeling of there could be anything here. Which is why so many times over the years, the stuff that I worked on was, finding little sections of the setting that nobody else particularly cared about, and then
Mhm.
saying, "Hey, folks, can I just have this? Can I do a book that is the whole solar system, or can I do a book that is the first world? Like, can I just make up all the Fey gods? And
Mhm.
people would go, yeah, okay, sure. And that's always been my favorite, when I had free reign to just go bonkers. And so Starfinder obviously was kind of the same thing, just at an even larger scale. Like, it was all uncharted territory.
Wow. Yeah, you know, that kinda makes me think why you were able to transition over to fiction writing so well, because it's the
Mm,
same thing. You're completely given free rein over to whatever you wanna do. There is not even,
right.
a basic framework in there for you. So
Yeah, I mean, and sometimes that can be terrifying, right? Like a
mhm.
a truly blank canvas. Uh, I can get paralyzed like anybody else, but
Mhm.
especially if you have just a little bit of restriction, right? If okay, this is, the solar system of Pathfinder, but in the future, like you've got a starting point, you've got, some touchstones, but then you can just go nuts. Uh, like I really like working that way, where I have just like a seed and then everything else is kind of improvised.
Mhm. So, how does your writing differ? When you're approaching writing for an RPG, right? Tabletop RPG, writing for a novel of your own, right, or something based in
Yeah.
Pathfinder, or writing a comic. That's like three completely different styles that you're able to
Yeah.
tackle.
Yeah, well, I think for novels and comics, I would say my writing process there has actually gotten closer over the years, where I
Hmm.
use the same process for both, because what I've realized is that in storytelling, for me, it's almost always about character arcs. And so the thing that I'll do for both, like for the new Starfinder comic series, or for even a young adult romance novel, like I'll go through and list all the characters, and then I will figure out, sort of what issue they're wrestling with. Like, what is the sort of emotional heart of this character? What is their fear? What is their misbelief about the world?
Hmm.
And then how, over the course of the story, does that change? Usually what it comes down to for me is like, what is the sort of lesson that I want this character to learn? And so I'll say, okay, well, I want this character to, at the beginning of the book, be afraid to let anybody close to them emotionally, and then by the end I want them to be confident enough
Hmm.
to allow the possibility of being hurt, uh in order to let people in. And so, once I've got those start and end points, I'm very actually mathematical about plotting out, that character arc of, okay, well, I need, whatever it is, 7 beats
Right.
in here, so that uh I can make sure that I go at the right pace. I feel like pacing of character change is sort of,
Hmm.
and like emotional growth is the most important thing. And so having it really charted out, where it's like, okay, here's the start, the end, the midpoint, here's the point where they start to, get an inkling of how they're going to need to change, but they reject it, and, or here's, the point at the end where they were changing, but then something goes wrong and confirms their negative beliefs about the world, and so everything blows up in their face. Like
Hmm.
I I chart out those plot beats, and I do that for every character, and also oftentimes for every relationship. So
Hmm.
how are two characters going to change and how they relate to each other over the course of the
Right.
story? And I find that once I have all those threads and have them all chopped up into individual beats, I can start putting those together like puzzle pieces.
Hmm.
And what that does is it allows me to make sure that in every scene, regardless of what is happening in the plot, right? Like whether it's a space battle or a dragon attack or whatever, I always want to know what's going on emotionally inside the characters, because I think that's what adds extra depth and flavor to the
Right.
scene. So like it's fun to have a big action sequence, and I love writing big splashy action sequences, but the only thing that makes a laser gun battle better is if it's a laser gun battle that also in some way has, the hero thinking about their relationship with their partner, and the partner thinking about how they need to, change how they're living. Like those internal states are what give the action weight.
Hmm.
And so that's something that I always keep in mind. And then obviously, you know world building and writing for games is a totally different thing, but there I get to indulge a lot more of my just sort of improv techniques with writing setting material. I love the stream of consciousness where you just sort of sit down and go, all right, well, what sort of weirdness could I come up with off the top of my head? And I just start
Hmm.
writing. And sometimes I have an idea that I'm shooting towards, but sometimes, like if I've just got a blank map that I'm filling stuff up, I love treating it as a game for myself. Like I'll, make up a bunch of location names and just sort of randomly, and then try to figure out a backstory that would justify them.
Hmm.
or I'll put dots on the map and say, okay, why is this dot here? Like this dot is in, if this dot is on a river, well, probably it's a city, and probably that city is has a lot of water power, or maybe they, are a shipping concern or whatever. But if this dot is over here in the middle of
Hmm.
nowhere, well, why is it in the middle of nowhere? There must be a reason. What magical resource do they have there? Why is it a crossroads? Is there, is it a ruined city? Is it, some sort of magical site that's really hard to get to? And so I just like, I love playing those games for myself where I give myself a seed without actually knowing the answer. And then I try to find the answer and like whatever the most interesting answer would be.
Wow. So this is really informative to me, actually, hearing your process. I think this is really cool. I'm
Oh,
thinking back
thanks.
how I can do things better myself, quite frankly, now. Um, Along those lines, what advice do you have for people who are interested in becoming RPG writers or novelists, which I've aspired to do both, uh, or comics?
I mean, so I think the answer for all of those is you just have to do it and you have to put
Yeah.
yourself out there. So, for instance, if you want to be a novelist, the only way to be a novelist is to write a novel and then send out, query letters to literary agents, or I mean, self-publish if you want. But I've really appreciated the traditional publishing process. So if
Hmm.
people want to try publishing, conventionally, I think that that's a worthwhile thing to do. Self-publishing is awesome, but self-publishing requires a much broader skill set
Mm.
than novel writing, and you have to want to be a publisher. And there are
Right. Right.
having worked at a publisher, there's a lot of parts of publishing that are not as fun as writing stories.
Right.
So I am happy to outsource that to a publisher rather than doing it all myself. But yeah, you just have to write the book. You have to send it out there, query agents, and try to make it, and accept that you're going to get rejected a million times. Like, you never stop getting rejected. I was just talking at a high school the other day and explained to the kids that like a career in the arts means you never stop getting rejected. I get rejected constantly, and if I ever stop getting rejected, I know that I'm setting my sights too low.
Mm.
You should
Hmm.
always like want to be getting rejections because that shows that you're actually striving and trying for the best possible thing you can get. In terms of getting into comics, it's kind of the same way where you need to make something so that you have portfolio pieces to show. Uh, I think that that's, you could probably get in somewhere with just a script. Like that does happen. But I think if you can find an artist friend, find an artist on, DeviantArt or wherever,
Right.
somebody who's also trying to break in. And if you can team up to just do a 4, 8, 12 page kind of mini comic just to show that you can tell a complete story and that you understand how to write for sequential art like that. I think that goes a long way toward convincing publishers that you're serious, because everybody wants to write comics. How do you stand out from the pack? And everything I've learned says that the best way you can do it is by making comics. Now that said, I got in through the side door because when the Pathfinder comics,
Right.
which were originally written by Jim Zub, when Zub moved on to doing a lot of Marvel
Yeah.
stuff, he kind of handed the torch off to me and Eric Mona and Wes Schneider, and so we got to learn on the job. And actually, I will recommend everybody, if you want to write comics, go to Jim Zub's website. I think it's just like either jimzub.com or zub.com. He has a whole section of tutorials on how to write comics,
Mm.
how the comics business works, all of that. And I learned everything I know about comics from Zub. So it worked for me. Maybe it'll work for you as well. But I can't recommend that highly enough. And then for getting in with games, I mean, there are contests like RPG Superstar is still going, I
Right.
believe. That's a good way to get your name out there. You can also, there are lots of smaller third party publishers that uh, oftentimes, they don't have a lot of money, but if you show up and say, hey, I love what you're doing, here's the work that I've done, they might take a shot on you. and you're going to have more luck getting in there than you are
Mhm.
if you go to Wizards and say, "Hey, I've never published anything before, but I'd love to write for D&D." Like, you're
Right.
probably not going to get in there. But if you can get in at, a small third party, then you can roll that up into getting an assignment at a large third party. And then from there, maybe you get in with Paizo or Wizards or one of the bigger companies or Fantasy Flight. And I often think of careers in the arts as like a Katamari Damacy. If you remember that game where you're just like rolling your snowball of stuff,
Mhm.
uh, like you're always just rolling every little assignment into a bigger assignment and a
Right.
bigger assignment. And that's for me, that's how I've done it, where you just every project that you complete is a stepping stone to the next project. But that means that if you want to get started, it doesn't matter how small your thing is, and
Right.
if you can't get in at a company, just make something, like it's there's plenty of free, layout software and stuff online, just write up stats for a monster and put it on a blog, post it on social media, do a little adventure and release it for free, do a one page RPG when that comes around
Right.
each year, um, just making things so that then when there is an opening somewhere, whether it's an open call or a job application, uh, like you can send in with your application, here's my portfolio, here's what I've made. And in the game industry, nobody cares about what degrees you have.
Mhm.
Nobody cares about anything except, can you do the job and can you show that you've already done the job? And that's where I think that's what gets you ahead. And I also think working in the game industry uh, is a great way to learn how to do all this stuff, right? Get that internship, apply for the entry level position as a developer or an editor or whatever. Or, the same is true also if you want to get into fiction. Like, the fastest way to level up your writing skills is to read submissions for a magazine you like.
Mhm.
Every every small press magazine, and all fiction magazines are small press pretty much. Like,
Right.
everyone I know is overworked and has too many submissions. And so if you come in there and say, "Hey, I'll read your slush pile and pick out the good stories," not only does that get you in a way where you're now working with the people who make these decisions, you get to understand their tastes, you get to understand
Mhm.
what they like and don't like, but also just by reading, hundreds of manuscripts, you start to notice the things that bother you as an editor,
Mhm.
and then not to do them. One of my first jobs on Dungeon Magazine was I was in charge of the slush pile, because at the time Dungeon people just sent in their adventures,
Right.
and you would say, "Are we going to publish this? Yes or no?" Or they'd send in pitches, I think. And there was a time on the message boards like, because that was my job, that there was a group of them that called me the gray render,
Mm.
because I was just tearing apart all of these submissions, because that was my job, was to cull the pile. uh but I learned so much about what made a good adventure by reading all of these and seeing what sparks me and what doesn't. And I think that principle applies to basically every form of art. So if you can work on both sides of the desk, I think it's a huge leg up.
Yeah, no. Wow, that's fantastic. I that last part, especially about going through the slush pile and seeing what you don't like and getting an
Yeah,
eye for yourself, because you gotta self-educate yourself somehow. And usually
exactly.
it's you're waiting on other people to tell you, oh, this is bad, you need to do this better. Here, you're training yourself to do it.
Well, and it's also learning not just, what's good or bad, but also learning your own tastes,
Right.
right?
Right.
Like,
Right.
I often tell people, I spent the first couple years at Paizo, or at least the first year, just learning what was cool. Just, I came in not really knowing what I wanted to do in RPGs, or like what made for good RPG content. And I spent so much time just hanging out with James Jacobs and Wes Schneider and Eric Mona and like all these other folks, and just sort of absorbing the media that they liked, learning
Right.
about, horror from Wes, or learning about, dark fantasy stuff from James Jacobs, or
Mhm. Mhm.
old occult stuff from Eric Mona. Like, there was so much that I learned that informed my tastes and made it easier for me to both write stuff that I liked and that I was excited about, but also like it taught me how to write for them too. And like
Right.
together we sort of
Right.
formed this more cohesive voice for the game. And that was only possible because we were all reading and watching the same things as each other. We were always bringing stuff to the table, to the communal pot, and that was really an education.
Very cool. Well, it looks like you have a lot of things coming out. So the book will have just been released yesterday, Dark
Yeah,
Hearts.
yeah. Please go check out Dark
Yeah.
Hearts.
The Angels of the Drift comes out later on in the month.
Yeah,
Um,
the first and actually, so the first floppy issue, the monthly
yeah.
issue number 1 comes out in late June, but there's a Kickstarter running right now. If you want to just
Yeah.
back the Kickstarter and get the whole hardcover collection when the 5 issue sort of story arc is complete, you can just go back that right now and be one and done. And when the series is complete, they'll send you the hardcover.
That's what I just did this morning. I actually asked for the
Oh,
signed hardcover, so I'd appreciate a
well,
little
thank you.
custom message in there. Only 50
Yeah, if
bucks. It's a
they
great deal, man.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. If they let me, I think I have no idea how exactly that signing process
yeah,
works.
that's
If I'm just
okay.
gonna
No,
like
that's okay. Yeah.
wake up and there's a pallet of books at my door, but
But what other
but
what other
yeah.
cool stuff do you have coming out? What else is going on?
Well, honestly, I mean, between launching Dark Hearts, which has been,
Right.
it's been 18 months between selling the
Wow.
book and
Wow.
it getting published, which is
Yeah.
pretty normal for a
Yeah.
novel. So like I'm really just in that last stretch of spending all my time trying to get the word out.
Right.
And of course, the comic series is ongoing, so I'm still
Right.
working on that. I just, my inbox right now has some cool art and colors
Yeah.
from
Yeah.
the final issues. But I'm also, I'm finishing up the next young adult romance novel that'll hopefully
Right.
be out the following summer and is all about a teenage ghost hunter.
Hmm.
And yeah, really, that is everything that's on my plate right now. I hope there are more Starfinder comics beyond this
Right.
initial 5 issue run, but of course that'll
Mhm.
depend on how the audience likes it.
Right.
So if you want to see more, please do support earlier rather than later.
Excellent.
You've got that hardcover
Yeah.
option, so there's no
Yeah.
excuse to wait for it to be done.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I've been trying desperately to take on fewer freelance projects and really just focus on a couple of big things like the
Right.
novels and the comics. But it's so hard every time somebody comes to me and goes, "Hey, we've got this awesome adventure. Wouldn't you like to write it?" And it's like, "Oh, I would like to write it."
Yeah.
That happened to me with I thought I was done writing adventures for a while. And then I ended up writing the first adventure of Pathfinder's Gatewalkers
Oh, right.
adventure
Right. Right.
path
Yeah. Yeah.
because Patrick Reaney, the developer
Yeah.
who was in charge of it, came to me and said, "Hey, do you want to write? You want to kick off this adventure path?" And I went, "Oh, I don't have time." And then he said, "Okay, so it's going to go to the first world and other planets, and it's going to be like an X-Files sort of vibe with like a Slender Man thing." And I was just like, "You did this on purpose. Like you purposefully made an adventure that I
Yeah.
couldn't say no to."
Yeah.
Um, and it turns out it was a blast to write, and I'm just now finishing up running that whole campaign for my home group. So
Nice.
that's been really, really a delight.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, James, this has been a wonderful opportunity for me to get a chance to chat with you and get to know you. And thanks so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Hey, thanks for having me. This is really, it's always fun to be back on No Direction.